Robert Baratheon awoke one morning in the Red Keep with a head that did not pound, for the first time in what seemed like an age. The morning sun threaded through the curtains of his bedchamber, illuminating the motes of dust that danced across his vision. He blinked at the brightness and, for once, did not curse it. Every day before, he might have spat at the pain it caused in his eyes, a dull ache from too many cups of wine the night before. On this day, though, he felt clear-headed, almost suspiciously so, as if someone had replaced his skull with another man's entirely. Yet he knew the reason. He had sworn off the drink. And unlike so many other mornings that began with shaky promises, this time he truly meant to keep it. He rose slowly, body still thick and powerful, but softened by years of indulgence. Once he had been the finest warrior in the realm, a man who slew princes and toppled dynasties. He could still recall the sound of Rhaegar Targaryen's chest caving in beneath his war hammer, the rush of victory that had swept through him. Where had that man gone? Buried under barrels of ale and flagons of wine, lost to the small pleasures he had used to numb his regrets. He stretched his shoulders, hearing the pop of stiff joints. On this day, he felt something akin to purpose surging within him, driving away the memories of the complacent, drunken king he had become. Outside his door, a pair of Kingsguard stood at attention. Their armor shone in the early sun, bright as hope. Robert noted their practiced stoicism, a reminder that these men served a king. For too long, he had let himself become a figure of derision rather than respect. Today, he intended to change that. He nodded once at them, clearing his throat as if to confirm that his voice was strong. They responded in kind, crisp bows of their helmeted heads, offering no words but a silent show of respect. That morning, Robert felt he had done something to deserve it. He made his way to the council chambers, steps methodical. The corridors of the Red Keep felt strangely new. He did not see the tapestries as reminders of past triumphs or humiliations. Instead, they seemed alive with color, scenes of hunts and battles that invoked in him an old excitement. The hush of servants scurrying aside, the brushing of his boots against the stone floor, the distant calling of gulls over Blackwater Bay. Everything felt sharper, more vivid. He had grown too accustomed to stumbling about in a wine-soaked haze, ignoring all the details of life around him. Now it was as if the world had reawakened. Within the council chamber, Grand Maester Pycelle was already at his seat, penning something on a lengthy scroll. The old man glanced up, eyebrows raised to see the king arrive earlier than expected. Littlefinger lounged in his customary place, a mocking half-smile on his lips that froze momentarily when he realized Robert was not lurching and hungover or reeking of ale. Lord Renly was there as well, wearing a green velvet doublet embroidered with golden stags. He set aside some parchment containing notes on the realm's finances and gave Robert a bright-eyed nod. Varys glided into the room from some hidden passage, as he was apt to do, hands folded demurely across his robes. Even he, the master of whisperers, seemed off guard to witness the king in such a state of uncharacteristic composure. Ser Barristan Selmy stood by one wall, silent and steadfast, the very image of a white knight. Robert met Barristan's eyes. He thought he detected a faint warmth there, a subtle sign that the old knight was glad to see the king more awake, more alive. "Shall we begin?" Robert said, voice surprisingly firm. He took his seat at the head of the table and exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. Littlefinger cleared his throat. "We have the matter of the crown's debts, your grace. As always, the crown owes considerable sums to the Iron Bank of Bravos, among other creditors. There's also the issue of—" Robert held up a hand. "We'll address the debts in due time, Peter. But first, I want to make one thing clear. I intend to rule, not just sit on this throne. If we are to keep the peace in the realm, we must act with purpose. No more of this drifting along, ignoring the cracks forming under our feet. Let's start with a full reckoning of the treasury. How much we owe, how much we have, and how we might pay it back." Littlefinger's sly smile returned. "As you say, your grace, I'll prepare the ledgers and have them delivered to you by tomorrow." Grand Maester Pycelle coughed politely. There is also the matter of certain shipments of grain from the Reach. The storms have delayed them, and Old Town begs the Crown's assistance to clear the roads and ensure supplies are not lost to bandits. Robert nodded. A matter for the Lord Commander of the City Watch and the Marshals of the Crownlands, yes. Renly, see to it that word is sent to ensure safe passage. If we can spare any men, we do so. The harvest was good, but that won't matter if the grain never makes it here or rots on the roadside. Renly scribbled a note and nodded. At once, brother. Varys's voice slipped in like silk. There have also been whispers, Your Grace, about certain disgruntled lords in the Stormlands and beyond. Some suggest you have been less attentive in past years to their needs. I would not bring such concerns if they were not growing louder. Robert felt a twist in his gut, remembering how he had neglected many of his duties, letting the realm run itself while he drowned in wine. I'll see them placated. I'll host a gathering for my vassals soon and show them the king is back. If there are complaints, let them bring them to me. I am not a tyrant, nor am I blind. We can settle matters fairly. Ser Barristan stepped forward, his white cloak flowing. Your Grace, if I may speak, we should also consider your own health. It has been some time since you've trained in the yard. A strong king shows strength to his people. Robert smirked, faintly reminded of a time when he relished the clang of steel in the practice yard. I, Barristan, I'll be in the yard this afternoon. See that someone meets me there worthy of a challenge. The look he gave the Kingsguard suggested a playful threat. Once, Robert had been unstoppable in tourneys. Perhaps he could recapture a piece of that old glory. They moved on to other matters of state, trade routes, disputes over fishing rights, the condition of the Royal Navy. Robert paid attention, offering directions, but he could feel his mind drifting now and then to an image of him gripping a practice sword, sweat running down his brow. He was anxious to prove to himself that he was still capable of the feats he once performed. For so long, he had hidden behind his crown as though it were a heavy mask, avoiding the reflection in any polished surface that reminded him he was not who he used to be. At length, the council concluded. Robert rose from his seat, feeling the eyes of his counselors upon him. This was a new dynamic, a shift in the atmosphere of the Red Keep. In the old days, he would have rushed off to the nearest flagon of wine to celebrate the end of a tedious meeting. Not today. He made his way toward the yard, summoning a squire to fetch him a set of practice arms, a battered helm, and a shield bearing the crowned stag of House Baratheon. Word spread quickly through the castle that the king was to train. By the time Robert arrived at the yard, a small audience had gathered, guardsmen, servants, and a few curious knights. They whispered among themselves, uncertain if this was a drunken whim or something different. Robert felt his pulse quicken as he saw the practice swords arrayed on a stand. He had been an athlete once, his body trained to the rigors of battle. In the rebellion that put him on the throne, he had been the unstoppable Storm Lord, the man who had cracked the prince's breastplate with a single blow of his war hammer. That seemed a lifetime ago, replaced by the bloated indulgences of a king who felt the crown was more curse than blessing. He rolled his shoulders and picked up a wooden blade. Its weight felt unfamiliar in his hand, but not entirely alien. He gave it a few test swings. The watchers murmured. He lifted the shield, tested its straps, then nodded at Ser Barristan. The Lord Commander chose a blunted longsword from the rack. A hush fell. They circled each other. Robert felt the blood rushing in his ears, a primal drumbeat that reminded him of his younger days. Barristan Selmy was no green boy. He was a legendary knight and had faced opponents from all corners of the realm. But Robert Baratheon, even in his softened state, could still move with surprising power. Barristan tested him with a quick jab. Robert blocked with the wooden shield, the clang echoing over the yard. The watchers drew in a breath. Robert swung the practice sword in a broad arc. Barristan deflected it easily but took a step back. Robert pressed forward, a series of quick strikes that forced the White Knight to give ground. For a few moments, Robert forgot his own exhaustion, forgot the years that had weighed on him. He was simply himself again, a warrior straining every muscle toward victory. Barristan responded with a cunning slash. Robert had not quite the speed to fully avoid it, and the tip of the blunted blade rang off his shoulder guard. Pain flared, but the protective padding kept it from being a serious blow. Robert grunted, lowered his shield, and lunged. A few watchers cheered when the practiced sword smacked against Barristan's side. The old knight nodded in respect, acknowledging the hit. They broke apart, gasping slightly for breath. On they went, exchanging blow after blow. Robert felt the burn in his arms and thighs, a testament to how badly out of shape he was. Yet he felt alive in a way he had not in years. Sweat ran into his eyes, but he refused to yield. Barristan, for his part, was older but still swift. The watchers cheered each near strike, each clever feint. At last, Barristan signaled his concession with a tap to Robert's shield. "Your grace fights like a younger man," the knight said, chest heaving. "A most welcome sight." Robert laughed, short and sharp, through his own panting. "I fight like a bull that's let out of the pen after too long." "Thank you, Barristan." He removed the helm, letting the cool air of the courtyard wash over his flushed face. Those assembled began to clap, timidly at first, then louder. Robert was the king, and for the first time in ages, he had shown them a glimpse of what he once was, a warrior. He was not simply the jolly drunk who roared about old battles he barely remembered. That day, many in the Red Keep found new respect for their king, or at least a spark of curiosity about what changes might come. Robert, exhausted, made for the royal baths. In the steaming water, he scrubbed himself vigorously. Muscles ached that had not ached in years. He felt the bruise on his shoulder, the sting of a shallow cut on his forearm, but more than anything, he felt relief. He had not collapsed in front of everyone. He had not made a fool of himself. If anything, he had surprised them. Perhaps, he thought, there was hope. The day passed in a flurry of small tasks. He ate a hearty meal without wine, washing it down with watered ale that did not threaten to fog his mind. He met with a few lords who had petitioned him for judgments in minor disputes. He made sure to listen, really listen, to their concerns. By the time the sun began to sink over the city, casting golden light across the rooftops, he found himself in the Royal Solar, reading the ledger's Littlefinger had delivered. Numbers were never Robert's strong suit, and he quickly grew frustrated at the tangle of debts and expenditures. But he stuck to it, ignoring the creeping urge to call for a cup of something stronger than water. That night, he collapsed into bed, physically and mentally exhausted, but proud. His mind drifted to the next steps. If he was to truly reform himself, it would take more than a single day's resolve. He had to show the realm he was not just paying lip service to the notion of ruling. He had to mend relationships, settle grievances, and make moves on the chessboard of politics that he had once despised. Otherwise, the Seven Kingdoms would devour themselves from within, and no amount of martial prowess or half-forgotten valor would save them. He closed his eyes, praying briefly to the Seven for guidance, which was another thing he had not done in far too long. Then sleep claimed him without the hazy swirl of alcohol, and he dreamed of storms and stags, of a younger self charging into battle with a hammer in hand. The next day dawned. Robert woke feeling stiff but clear-headed. He moved through his morning routine with renewed determination. Where once he might have quaffed wine from a jeweled goblet at breakfast, now he drank only water. He took a moment to stare at his own reflection in the polished silver plate on the table. He saw the lines on his face, the thick beard with more than a few strands of gray, and the eyes that still carried a spark of the old fury. He turned away from that reflection, not out of shame, but because he could not afford to lose time gazing at a man he barely recognized. He had decided the night before. He would send out ravens, calling his major vassals to King's Landing for a grand feast and council. Officially, it would be a show of unity, a chance for the lords to voice their concerns directly to the king. Unofficially, Robert knew it was a test for himself. Could he stand before them and lead, as he once had on the battlefield? He informed his council of this decision. Littlefinger offered that crooked smile of his, but agreed to handle the financial details, food, lodging, and the like. Varys, with his soft voice, promised to see that the roads were kept free of trouble, using whatever clandestine methods might be at his disposal. Renly seemed genuinely pleased, already envisioning the pomp and pageantry. Pycelle muttered about the cost, but Robert waved away such concerns. "We'll tighten our belts in other ways," he said. "This I must do." Over the following weeks, ravens flew across the realm. Lords from the north to Dorne, from the Stormlands to the Iron Islands, received summons with the royal seal. Many had not set foot in the capital for years, content to handle their own domains while a complacent king looked the other way. Now, curiosity piqued and the promise of a renewed monarchy drew them forth. The city stirred in anticipation. Inns filled, merchants arrived with wares from all corners, and the street singers began composing ballads about the awakening of King Robert. The small folk mostly hoped for a good feast, perhaps a chance to see a royal procession. They whispered that the king had found new strength, that he had wrestled a giant boar in the Kingswood without a single drop of wine. Rumors swirled in every tavern and street corner, exaggerated with each telling. As the lords began to arrive, Robert stood on the dais in the throne room to greet them. He wore a grand cloak of black and gold, clasped at the shoulder with a brooch shaped like a stag's head. His crown, heavy though it was, gleamed atop his thick hair. Standing by his side was Cersei Lannister, her emerald eyes watching the guests with a cool detachment. Their marriage had been strained for years, the warmth drained away by mutual resentment and secrets. But Robert had insisted that as king and queen, they must present a united front. Whether or not Cersei believed in his transformation, she played her part well. Lord Tywin Lannister arrived with a retinue from the Westerlands, flanked by gold-cloaked soldiers displaying the Golden Lion. His imposing presence carried with it a wave of hushed awe. Lord Eddard Stark came from the north, looking uncomfortable in the southern heat, but resolute as ever. Robert felt an old happiness at seeing his friend again. Ned Stark might have been the only man in the realm who truly cared for him as a person, not just as a king. As Ned kneeled, Robert all but dragged him up into a crushing hug. The court watched, murmuring about the closeness between the king and the Warden of the North. From the Vale came Lord Jon Arryn's heirs and bannermen. Robert's heart panged. Jon had been like a father to him, and he still felt that loss keenly. From the Riverlands, host after host arrived wearing the trout sigil of House Tully. Ser Brynden Blackfish Tully was among them, along with various lesser lords. The Tyrells of Highgarden sent a grand procession, resplendent in green and gold, carrying crates of fresh fruit and flowers to present to the king. Even the Greyjoys made a token appearance, though Balon himself did not come, sending a nephew instead, along with a small retinue of Ironborn who looked ill at ease in the polished halls of the Red Keep. Amidst all these arrivals, the air was thick with speculation. What did the king intend? Was he truly changed? Or was this some elaborate show? Some whispered that his sobriety would not last, that eventually the old Robert would resurface, roaring for wine and chasing serving girls through the halls. Others suggested the king might be planning to crack down on rebellious elements, using the gathering as a trap. Yet Robert greeted them all with practiced courtesy, if a bit stiff. He was determined to show them a new side of himself, but he did not entirely trust his own ability to hold his temper when tested. That evening, the great feast began in the throne room. Tables groaned under the weight of roast boar, duck, fish from the Blackwater, and exotic dishes from the Summer Isles. Musicians played lively tunes, and jugglers performed for the amusement of the gathered lords and ladies. The king and queen sat on a slightly elevated platform, overseeing the revels. Robert permitted himself a single cup of watered wine, sipping sparingly. He forced his attention on the conversation, the music, and the sight of so many banners together in one hall. At some point, Eddard Stark rose to approach the dais. Robert waved him closer. Ned's eyes flicked to the half-empty cup near the king's hand. "I see you're not indulging tonight," Ned said quietly, so only Robert could hear. Robert set the cup down with a deliberate motion. "No, I'm not. I can't afford to." He leaned forward, voice lowered. "I was a fool, Ned. I nearly lost myself. This realm, it's more fragile than I ever cared to admit. I need to set it right if I can." Ned's stern features softened a fraction. You'll find no argument from me. I'm glad to see you well. But you should know, not all lords will welcome this. Some profited from the old ways, from your lack of attention. They might not be pleased to see a king who actually rules." "I'll deal with them," Robert said firmly, though in his heart he wondered how. He could swing a hammer well enough, but politics were a different battlefield entirely. "At least I have you by my side." Ned nodded. "Always." Throughout the feast, Robert made an effort to speak with every major lord, to ask about conditions in their lands and to listen, really listen, to their replies. He learned that the North had seen fewer problems with wildlings since the last ranging, but House Bolton was expanding its hold on certain territories. He learned that in the Riverlands, brigands had grown bolder, and Lord Tully was struggling to protect smaller villages. He heard about tensions between some vassals of House Tyrell, hints of dissatisfaction in the Reach, and from Pike, though few would speak plainly, he gleaned enough to suspect that the Ironborn were planning new raids as so. By the end of the night, his head swam with the magnitude of it, but he kept his resolve. He did not drown himself in wine. He accepted the swirling torrent of problems as part of his duty. His shoulders felt heavier than any armor he had ever worn. Yet inside his chest, that old warrior's spirit burned brighter than it had in years. He was doing this. He was being a king. When the feast ended, many of the guests retired to their chambers or found amusements in the city. Robert, though, convened a smaller gathering in the council chamber. He invited Ned Stark, Tywin Lannister, Renly, and a few other key figures. Cersei chose not to attend, claiming fatigue. Robert did not press her. He doubted she had any desire to see him succeed in matters that could jeopardize her family's influence. Still, her absence concerned him. He stored that thought away for later. Seated at the head of the table, Robert looked over the somber faces. "I won't take much of your time tonight, but there are matters we should address. Ned has told me of problems in the Riverlands with bandits. Lord Tywin, I know the west borders part of that region. We may need your help to send some forces to keep the peace. Will you do it?" Tywin's expression was as inscrutable as always. "The West has its own defenses, Your Grace. But if our interests align, I see no reason not to assist. Provided, of course, that the Crown acknowledges our expenses and that any disruptions caused by such an expedition are not laid at my doorstep." Robert grunted, irritated by the man's politicking. But he reined in his anger. "Fine. We can arrange some compensation for your efforts. Thank you, Lord Tywin." He turned to Ned. "You know the Riverlands better than most. Work with Tywin's men if need be. Clean out those outlaws. The small folk have suffered enough." Ned nodded, still clearly uneasy about working with Tywin Lannister. But if it was the king's order, he would obey. They discussed more matters. The need to rebuild certain roads, to ensure merchant caravans could travel safely, to address the crown's debts through increased trade tariffs. It was a taxing conversation, half of it tangled in the complexities of alliances and obligations. Yet Robert persisted. He felt an old pain behind his eyes, but it was not from wine. It was from the weight of responsibility. At last, the meeting broke. Ned lingered a moment, as did Renly, who gave Robert an encouraging smile. "This is a better look on you, brother," Renly said. "I might almost believe you enjoy ruling." Robert scoffed, but not unkindly. "I won't go that far, but we do what we must." Over the next weeks, the presence of so many high lords in King's Landing sparked both celebration and tension. Feasts, hunts, and justs were held. Robert participated in a hunt in the Kingswood, keen to prove he was still capable of bringing down a boar without a drop of wine. He succeeded in spearing a smaller boar, though not with the grace he once possessed. The court applauded his kill all the same. In private, he spent more hours in the training yard, pushing his body to reclaim some of its old vigor. He made sure to give audience to lesser lords, knights, even some small folk who had grievances. Gradually, a sense of renewed respect for the crown began to spread. Yet not all was well. Shadows lurked. Varys came to him one evening to report rumors of plots. Disgruntled lords from distant corners, who had profited from the king's inattention, now found themselves facing new levies, new demands for accountability. Some whispered that a stronger king was dangerous to their autonomy. There were hints of bribes being passed, quiet alliances being formed. Robert had expected this. He had turned a blind eye to corruption for so long, it stood to reason that rooting it out would make enemies. Moreover, the tension between Robert and Cersei grew. She was cold to him, even scornful, mocking his newfound zeal for kingship as if it were an embarrassing hobby. Behind closed doors, they argued. Robert reminded her that House Lannister had gained plenty of power from his neglect, and that things were going to change. She retorted that she was simply doing what was best for her children. That word, children, was another dagger to Robert's heart, for he suspected the truth about Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, that they were not his, but he could not bring himself to face that head-on yet. The realm had enough problems without the king sparking a civil war by denouncing his own heirs. Still, the unspoken knowledge festered between them, a wound that would not heal. As the weeks wore on, the Feast of Unity and Council drew to a close. Many lords began their journeys home, armed with new directives from the king. Ned stayed a bit longer, conferring with Robert on strategies to stabilize the realm. One evening, as they walked along the ramparts overlooking Blackwater Bay, Ned dared to speak of a matter that lay heavily on Robert's mind. "My friend," Ned said quietly, "I do not wish to sour our reunion, but the rumors about your heirs, they abound." Robert's hands tightened on the stone merlin. "Rumors? Rumors," he repeated bitterly. "I wish they were only that." Ned exhaled. "You must decide what you will do. If you let this poison linger, it could devour the realm." Robert shut his eyes. He imagined for a moment what would happen if he publicly denounced Joffrey. The realm could split apart. Tywin Lannister would not stand idle. Blood would flow. The king's newfound strength might not be enough to hold everything together. He thought of the boy, Joffrey, arrogant and cruel though he was. He thought of Myrcella and Tommen, who had done no harm except to be born into a lie. "I cannot cast them out," Robert said at last. "Not yet. I'm not sure I ever can. The realm isn't ready for that. Nor am I." Ned placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Then you must find another path, Robert. But do so carefully. Cersei will sense any threat to her children." Robert nodded, gaze lost in the dark water below. "I know." In an effort to distract himself from these grim possibilities, Robert focused on implementing reforms that could steadily fix the kingdom's finances and security. He ordered an audit of the crown's expenditures. He began negotiations with Bravos to restructure some of the debt. He commanded the City Watch to crack down on corruption within their ranks. He took to summoning lesser officials and lords to personally question them about their duties. Some balked, shocked that the king was taking such an active role. Others adapted quickly, seeing an opportunity to gain favor by showing their competence. The machinery of government, long neglected, started to lurch back to life under the firm hand of the king. In the training yard, Robert sweated daily. He sparred not just with Barristan, but with younger knights as well, men who had never before had the chance to face their king in combat. He lost more than a few bouts at first, cursing as the youngsters danced around his heavier strikes. But day by day he improved, shaking off the inertia of years. He found a joy in the ring that he had once found only at the bottom of a wine cup. Gradually, he started to resemble, if not the unstoppable warrior of his youth, at least a formidable fighter with strength behind his blows and enough stamina to hold his ground. On a brisk morning, Robert and Ned decided to go hawking near the Blackwater. The huntsmen prepared a series of falcons, and the king and his entourage rode out in a small column. The crisp air felt good in Robert's lungs as the city's noise faded behind them. They let the falcons loose over a clearing, watching as the birds circled for prey. Robert and Ned chatted in low tones, occasionally glancing at the men who rode behind them, Kingsguard and loyal bannermen. The conversation drifted to old memories of Robert's rebellion, of the battles they had fought side by side. Robert's mood soured when he thought of Rhaegar Targaryen, the silver-haired prince who had once captured the hearts of so many. That day on the Trident, when Robert had smashed Rhaegar's chest in, was a turning point in the history of the realm. Yet, sometimes Robert questioned if that was truly the moment his life changed. Perhaps the real change happened after, when victory turned to the burden of kingship, and the woman he loved, Lyanna Stark, was lost forever. He looked at Ned, the weight of that old sorrow between them. "I dreamed of her last night," he said quietly. Ned's voice was gentle. "You've been thinking of her more these days?" Robert sighed. "She represents a time when I was different, when I believed in something purer. Sometimes I wonder if all this talk of me becoming a strong king again is a lie. Perhaps I'm just a man drowning in regrets, clawing at anything to stay afloat." Ned turned in the saddle to face him. "You're doing more than that, Robert. I see it every day. People in King's Landing see it. You're changing." They paused, letting the falcons do their work. Overhead, one dove and plucked a hair from the grass. The huntsman cheered. Robert watched silently. "When we get back, we should talk about the North. I know the Night's Watch has been complaining about short supplies. If winter is coming, as you Northerners love to say, we can't afford to let the Watch starve." Ned gave a small smile. "I'll draft a proposal and see what we can spare from the Crown stores." By midday, they returned with a good haul. Robert was tired but content. He had spent a morning in honest recreation, had spoken openly with Ned, and had no desire for wine. His guards seemed to sense the change in him. Their own morale lifted. A king who was active and resolute gave them pride in their service, or so it seemed to Robert. But not everyone was pleased. In the days that followed, certain lords began departing King's Landing with expressions of polite neutrality or hidden disdain. Robert received word that in some corners of the realm, new talk of rebellion simmered. At one point, Varys approached him, face as grave as Robert had ever seen it. "My little birds tell me that certain bannermen once loyal to House Targaryen, some who hid their sentiments for years, now see you as a threat. They speak of the last dragon across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen. They wonder if she might return to claim her father's throne." Robert's old hatred flickered. Once, he would have demanded an assassination immediately. But something in him hesitated. He had spent so many years fueling his hatred of the Targaryens, and what had it gained him? A crown that felt like a yoke around his neck. He did not trust Daenerys Targaryen, a dragon spawn though she was, but he also was not as quick to unleash bloodshed as he once might have been. "Keep an eye on her. If she sets foot on Westeros, we'll address it then." "I'm not dispatching assassins halfway across the world," Robert said at last. Varys nodded, though his expression revealed little of what he truly thought. Bit by bit, King's Landing adapted to a ruler who was no longer a complacent drunk. The small folk noticed fewer gold cloaks taking bribes. Men in the royal bureaucracy found that forging a signature or skimming coin from the treasury now carried greater risk. The city's thousands of hungry mouths saw an uptick in bread distribution when Robert ordered the royal granaries inspected and corruption rooted out. Though far from perfect, these changes sparked rumors that the king was good-hearted, reminiscent of the early days of his reign. But new problems appeared almost as quickly as old ones were solved. Some merchants complained that increased tariffs were strangling trade. Certain knights grumbled about having to follow stricter protocols. Cersei's faction in court whispered that the king was just posturing, and that House Lannister deserved greater say in the governance of the realm. Tensions rose between the king's watchers and Lannister soldiers stationed in the city. One evening, a brawl erupted in a tavern near the Gate of the Gods, leaving a Lannister guardsman dead. Robert personally oversaw the punishment of those responsible, making sure justice was done swiftly but fairly. Cersei seethed, claiming Robert was punishing her family. Robert responded that justice was justice, regardless of which banner the dead man served. In the midst of these tensions, Ned Stark prepared to return to the north. Before he left, Robert summoned him privately. They stood in the courtyard where the king's men were saddling horses, the morning sun slanting in from the east. Robert gazed at his old friend, a swirl of emotion in his eyes. "I won't keep you from Winterfell any longer," Robert said. "You have your own lands to care for, but I'd ask one more favor." Ned looked at him curiously. "Name it." Robert placed a calloused hand on Ned's shoulder. "Be my hand." Ned's eyes widened. "Robert, you're the only man I trust, truly trust, to watch my back and keep me from folly, especially now with so many damned snakes in the court. I need someone to help me see it through, this new path I'm trying to carve. Someone who isn't afraid to speak the truth, even if it angers me." Ned looked away, struggling with the weight of the request. "My family is in Winterfell. I promised Catelyn we wouldn't stay in the South for long. The North needs me." Robert's voice softened. "I know, but the realm needs you too. If we can't steady this ship, the North, the South, none of it will matter. War could break out again. I can't do this alone, Ned. Let me be blunt. Without you, I fear I'll falter." Ned's shoulders slumped a bit. He sighed. "Very well, Robert. I'll accept, for the good of the realm. But I must send for my family. We can't be parted for too long." "Of course," Robert said, relief washing over him. "I'll have quarters prepared for them. They'll want for nothing. You have my word." Ned nodded, still looking as though he were marching into a battlefield. In truth, he was. Court politics could be as lethal as any war. But if Robert Baratheon truly was determined to be a better king, Ned Stark would stand with him, come what may. The announcement of Ned Stark as Hand of the King spread quickly through King's Landing. Courtiers whispered, some calling Ned honorable but naive, others muttering that his presence signaled a shift in power away from the Lannisters. Cersei's expression when told was stone. But Robert did not waver. He needed Ned, and if it rankled the Lannisters, so be it. With Ned's new position, the pace of reforms accelerated. They began drafting new edicts to standardize taxes, reduce corruption, and fortify the crown's hold on the roads and trade routes. They also undertook the precarious task of shuffling key offices to place more trustworthy men in positions of power. Littlefinger was not pleased to have his finances scrutinized, but Robert insisted. Grand Maester Pycelle, old and cunning, sensed the shift in the wind but did little to resist overtly. Renly supported his brother, though he had his own ambitions. Stannis remained at Dragonstone, aloof and grim, but Robert knew he would eventually have to reconcile with him as well. Meanwhile, Robert continued his personal regime of exercise, training, and moderation. He felt his body respond, losing some of the excess weight. He moved more nimbly in the yard, and his reflexes improved with each passing day. Servants noted that the king's appetite for wine had not entirely vanished. He allowed himself small amounts on special occasions, but he no longer sank into drunken stupors that lasted for days. Instead, he spent his nights reading documents, conversing with Ned, or planning for the next step in reasserting his control over a realm that had nearly slipped through his fingers. One evening, as Ned worked late at a desk piled high with parchment, Robert joined him. The two shared a quiet moment, reading over petitions from various lords. At length, Robert broke the silence. "Do you recall, Ned, the times we spent in the Eyrie, training under Jon Arryn?" Robert asked, a wistful note in his voice. Ned looked up from his scroll. "Aye, we were boys then. Everything was simpler." Robert chuckled sadly. "I'd give half my crown to go back to those days. But we can't, can we? We have to move forward. For the sake of the realm." Ned nodded. "For the sake of the realm." A messenger entered, bowing deeply. "Your Grace, Lord Hand, there's news from the Stormlands. A small uprising near the marches. Nothing major, but the local lords request reinforcements." Robert sighed, setting aside the petition he'd been reading. "I'll handle it. Draft orders for a contingent of royal troops to support them. We can't allow these petty rebellions to fester." As the messenger left, Ned gave Robert a concerned look. "You must pace yourself. You're only one man." Robert shrugged. "If it's not me, it's no one. I let the realm fall into disrepair by neglect. Now it's time to set it right." In the weeks to come, Robert's new approach met its share of hurdles. Some rebellious pockets flared up, testing the king's resolve. But each time, Robert responded quickly, dispatching forces to quell disturbances. He insisted on harsh but fair measures, punishing true traitors while pardoning minor offenders who swore renewed loyalty. Slowly, the realm began to sense that the king was not to be trifled with. Word of these changes spread across the narrow sea as well. Traders coming from Pentos and Volantis carried tales of a revitalized Robert Baratheon. Some foreign merchants dismissed them as rumor, while others raised the possibility that Westeros might be unassailable if the king truly had regained his old strength. Daenerys Targaryen, wherever she was in Essos, would have to think twice before attempting any incursion. Robert's relationship with Cersei continued to deteriorate behind the scenes. She resented Ned Stark's new position, resented the fact that her family no longer held sole sway over the king. Their arguments became more frequent, more venomous. Robert, for his part, found he no longer cared to mend that rift. He saw the emptiness of their union. Only the question of the children kept him from taking drastic measures. On that subject, both he and Cersei avoided direct confrontation. Neither wanted to be the one to ignite the spark that could engulf the realm in civil war. One late evening, however, Robert stumbled upon Cersei in a hushed conversation with her brother Jaime Lannister in a secluded corridor. Their words halted the moment they saw him. Robert's eyes narrowed. He heard enough to guess they spoke of matters concerning Joffrey's future. Jaime's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, a reflex more of habit than aggression. Robert stared at them, an unspoken tension heavy in the air. "Good evening," he said curtly. Jaime offered a stiff bow, while Cersei simply held Robert's gaze with cold challenge. Without another word, Robert turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed down the hall, each step filled with suppressed anger. He might have once confronted them openly, demanded the truth, but the realm was too precarious. He needed more time, more leverage, if he was ever to do anything about that lie at the heart of his dynasty. As the moon rose high over King's Landing, Robert found himself alone in his solar, staring at a map of the Seven Kingdoms. He placed small carved figurines in strategic locations: the Stag of Baratheon in the Crownlands and Stormlands, the Wolf of Stark in the north, the Lion of Lannister in the west, and so on. The board was crowded, each region filled with potential conflict. In the old days, Robert had used force of arms to bend the realm to his will. Now he was trying to use reason, law, and good governance. It was infinitely more complex, more frustrating. Yet he found it gave him a certain sense of satisfaction. He was building something lasting, not just winning a single battle. He had changed. He knew it in his bones. The question was whether the realm could change with him, or whether it would snap back to its old ways the moment he showed any sign of weakness. He vowed not to show any. The king's hammer had become a pen, and the battlefield was his own council chamber. Still, he kept his war hammer in his private armory, well-oiled and ready. He might need it again someday. Seasons began to shift. The heat of summer lingered, but the days grew shorter. By the time autumn approached, Robert had made headway in reducing the crown's debt, mainly by negotiating with bravos and cutting superfluous expenditures. He had also enforced better tax collection, angering some petty lords who had grown used to pocketing coin that should have gone to the crown. He had reorganized the city watch, rooting out some of the worst corruption. King's Landing was still far from a utopia, but it was no longer the den of unchecked vice it had been. His biggest accomplishment, as far as many were concerned, was simply that he had maintained his sobriety and his presence. Court sessions were no longer jokes. Petitions were heard and resolved with expedience, rather than gathering dust while the king was too drunk or uninterested to bother. The realm saw that the king was awake, and an awake king was a dangerous king, to foes both foreign and domestic. In private, Robert knew that the question of succession would not remain buried forever. If he died without publicly acknowledging Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen as bastards, or if the truth came out, chaos would ensue. Part of him considered naming Stannis as heir, or even Renly, but both choices had risks. Stannis was rigid and unlovable, and the lords might not rally to him. Renly was charismatic but lacked the gravity necessary for a stable rule. And to pass over Cersei's children entirely would be to invite the wrath of Tywin Lannister, who might plunge the realm into another war. So Robert bided his time, hoping that perhaps Joffrey might grow into a better young man under a father who was no longer absent. It was a faint hope, and Robert knew it. Joffrey's cruel streak was plain. But what else could he do? One day, as the leaves turned golden in the Kingswood, Robert decided to inspect the new training of the City Watch personally. He rode out with Ser Barristan and Ned Stark, along with a modest retinue. The watchmen gathered information, wearing their gold cloaks with pride. Robert dismounted, walking among them. He noticed some fresh faces, younger recruits who had joined under the new system that demanded stricter discipline and less tolerance for corruption. He paused before one young watchman, barely past his 16th name day, freckles on his cheeks. "What's your name, lad?" Robert asked. "Owen, your grace," the boy replied, his voice trembling with awe. Robert nodded, eyeing the youth's stance. "Stand straighter, Owen. You're serving the crown now." He clasped the lad's shoulder. "You do your duty well, and there'll be rewards for you." The watchmen eyed each other, surprised at the king's personal attention. Once, Robert would never have bothered with such an inspection, too wrapped in his own indulgences. Now every watchman realized the king was paying attention. They had better do their jobs or face the consequences. Afterward, Robert, Ned, and Barristan rode along the streets of King's Landing. The city was far from pristine. Rats scurried in alleys, beggars still lined the lanes. But there was a noticeable calm. Crime had dipped, though it would never vanish entirely. Robert's presence was enough to keep most trouble at bay. Occasionally, small folk recognized the king, bowing or curtsying, some with genuine gratitude shining in their eyes. "It's a start," Ned said, surveying the bustle of commerce in the market squares. "Aye," Robert replied, scanning the crowds. "We'll see if it lasts." In the days that followed, correspondences from across the realm poured in with varied reports of success and strife. The Riverlands were calmer now that Tywin Lannister's forces had dealt with a few bands of brigands. The cost had been significant, but so far Tywin had not come demanding an outrageous sum. Perhaps even the mighty lion respected the changes in the king's manner, at least enough to keep negotiations civil. The Vale remained quiet under Lisa Arryn and her son, though Robert worried about that boy's fragility. The North seemed stable under the wardenship of the older Stark children, with Ned now serving as hand. The Reach reported good harvests, quiet for now, though House Tyrell was never a house to overlook. Dorne maintained its distance, as always, still nursing old grudges over Elia Martell and her children. Robert worked late into the night, reading these reports and drafting responses. Occasionally, he'd rub his temples, longing for the oblivion that wine once brought. But a single glance at the pile of scrolls awaiting his attention was enough to keep the cup from his lips. If he faltered, the realm might spiral again. He had tasted this new sense of purpose, and though it exhausted him, he could not let it go. Months passed in this manner. Robert grew stronger, more assured in his rule. His throne felt less like a curse now, though it still demanded all of him. He dealt with crises as they arose: raiders from the Stepstones, a plague scare in Old Town, a border dispute between the Tullis and the Freys. Through it all, Ned Stark stood by his side, offering counsel and support. Their friendship, tested by time and tragedy, deepened once more. If Robert ever doubted his path, he had only to look at Ned's steady gaze to recall why he was doing this. Beyond the horizon, threats lurked. Whispers of Daenerys Targaryen's growing influence in Essos came to Robert's ears. Word that she might have dragons circulated as a wild rumor. He was not sure whether to believe it, but he did not dismiss it out of hand. The winds of change were stirring across the sea, and if dragons had truly been reborn, Westeros would face a threat unseen for centuries. Yet Robert did not fling coin and assassins across the sea this time. He fortified the royal fleet, ensured that loyal men commanded the coastal garrisons, and waited. Reckless moves had cost many lives before. This time, if the Dragon Princess came, she would face a united kingdom with a king who was no longer lost in drink and regret. Winter approached. The days grew colder, especially in the north. But in King's Landing, the mild climate prevailed a while longer, giving Robert time to make final preparations. He sent more supplies to the Night's Watch, heeding Ned's warnings that whatever lay beyond the wall would only grow bolder in the cold months. He also arranged for the capital to store extra food in case the winter was harsher than expected. Such measures cost money the crown did not truly have, but Robert was determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The weeks before winter arrived were a flurry of activity. Lords came and went, some seeking audiences, others delivering tribute or news. The city's population swelled, then thinned as travelers departed for their home regions to pass the cold season in more hospitable surroundings. Through it all, Robert kept to his routine. Mornings in the yard, midday in council, afternoons receiving petitioners, evenings poring over documents, nights spent in restless sleep. He rarely saw Cersei except at official functions, where they wore masks of cordiality. Behind the scenes, her bitterness festered, but Robert refused to let it derail his mission. One cold dawn, he stood on a balcony overlooking the city, breath misting in the air. He wore a heavy fur cloak. The waters of Blackwater Bay glimmered under a pale, wintry sun. King's Landing sprawled below, smoke rising from countless chimneys. He saw the Red Keep's walls, the Mud Gate, Flea Bottom, the September of Baelor. He saw the realm's center of power, his seat of power, alive with activity. And he, Robert Baratheon, no longer felt like a stranger to it. He felt like its rightful king, not because of conquest alone, but because he had chosen to bear the responsibilities that came with the crown. His mind drifted back to that day. He first resolved to put aside the drink, to be more than a laughingstock on a golden throne. He remembered waking without the pounding headache, the choice he made to step forward rather than retreat into his cups. He remembered picking up the wooden sword in the training yard and feeling the eyes of the court upon him. All the steps in between had led him here, to this new vantage point where he could see the kingdom as something to be tended, not pillaged. A raven cawed overhead, and Robert looked up to see the black bird perched on a nearby ledge. Ravens brought messages of all sorts. Good news, bad news, omens or calls to war. He wondered what tidings might arrive next. Whatever they were, he would face them. He felt no desire to drown in wine or hide in denial. The realm needed a king who stood firm, and Robert intended to be that king. For a moment, he closed his eyes, listening to the distant sounds of the city waking, the chatter of merchants, the clatter of hooves, the cry of dockworkers. He let out a slow breath. He was not naive. He knew new challenges awaited, perhaps greater than any he had faced in the rebellion. There were still enemies in the shadows, still tensions that could erupt. But he was ready. He would not abandon the fight again. He felt the stirrings of hope, tempered by a warrior's practicality. Then he turned from the balcony and went inside to begin his day's work, heart steady and mind clear. The ghosts of the past would remain where they belonged, in memory. The future was his to shape, and Robert Baratheon, once drowning in drink, now stood tall, hammer or quill in hand, prepared to safeguard the 7 kingdoms he had won and finally chosen to rule.